Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our Lunch and Learn. We hope you're all doing so well. So we're just going to kick straight off. We're conscious that we've only got an hour today, and we know that everyone's time is really precious. So just a couple of housekeeping things I will cover first. So first of all, I'm Chanel. I'm Head of Marketing here at Utopi. Just a forewarning, today's session is being recorded. So if you would like to turn your camera off, then you are, of course, more than welcome to do so. We will be uploading today's session onto YouTube. So if anybody on your team has maybe missed out or can't be here today, feel free to just let us know and we can share the link with you all. If I could just ask that everybody mutes themselves, that would be great. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of today. Now, I'm conscious we've got quite a lot of content to get through for all of you. So just in case we run over, we will be sending out a post-session Q&A form. So you'll be more than welcome to submit any questions you might have. We can then organise calls or follow-ups, whatever it might be. But as we go through the sessions today, I appreciate people might have questions that come to mind. Please feel free to use the chat function. And then when we go into the Q&A session, I will use that as the premise for your questions and then feed them to Cedric and Stuart, who are our speakers. We'll also be following up with some documents after the call. So if you haven't had an email from us in the next day or two, please feel free to reach out to us at marketing@utopi.co.uk. Perfect. Okay, so time to kick off. I'm really, really happy to introduce my colleague, Stuart Patterson, who is Head of Impact and Head of Customer Success here at Utopi. He's a very modest man, so he's not going to like this intro, but the truth is no one knows the data and insights on the Utopi platform like Stuart does. So I'm really pleased to hand over to him. Stuart, take the floor.
Thanks very much, Chanel. I feel as if I've been slightly oversold there, so hopefully what comes next isn't a downfall on that. A couple of weeks ago, Chanel kindly asked if I could run a lunch session and cover some of the data and the insights that we gather. And I thought to myself, an hour I could probably cover quite a bit in an hour and do it justice. And then Chanel explained I only had between 20 and 25 minutes. So this will be a fairly high level overview. I'll do a deep dive into a couple of bits, but I appreciate that this is probably more just whetting the appetite than it is answering a lot of questions. But in order with the kind of time constraints that I have, in order to keep this focused today, I thought it'd be useful just to kind of ask a question and try and answer that question as well. And the question I came up with is what do we know now about your assets, about the industry that we didn't know before we started collecting all of this valuable data? So I guess the agenda that I came up with was I kind of obviously want to introduce the data. What is it? And I guess with that, the kind of so what. We have all of this data now at our disposal. What are we doing with it? What is it telling us? Who's it important to? So I guess to try and kind of bring that to life a little bit, I'll talk about some of the data use cases, so some of the operational insights that we see, some of the actionable insights, some behavioural archetypes that we've seen from some of the studies that we've ran, and then it sounds very mysterious, kind of uncovering the unknown. So what's already happening in these assets that we've understood, installing this technology and kind of gaining these insights, and then time permitting, I'll touch on a couple of case studies or recent case studies that we've recently done that have been made public with a couple of our customers. I guess in order to answer to kind of begin to answer that question, what is it we know now that we didn't know before? It's probably important just to provide or do a quick introduction for those of you who don't necessarily know exactly who Utopi are and what it is that we do. So who are Utopi? We're a specialist ESG technology provider. We collect real-time dynamic data on your assets to provide a holistic view of portfolio, site performance, right down to building and individual space performance. The technology allows key stakeholders, so investors, asset managers, operators, and the residents, the ability to see and manage performance through insights and automation, with the view of reducing the environmental impact of these assets and ultimately increasing their value as well. So a little bit about the data itself. To date, we have collected 9 billion environmental data points for analysis. I guess just to kind of put that in perspective a little bit, an average UK multi-tenant real estate asset, we might collect anywhere in the region of 70 million environmental data points annually around that asset. So it gives us a huge amount of granular data on that asset, how it performs, and ultimately how people live within these within these buildings. So what exactly is this data set made up of? So we have environmental data, we have energy data, we have regionalised carbon generation data, and external weight data as well, in order to provide kind of context to all of the environmental data that we collect. We also have things like people counting, and data that come from the smart heating controls that we install. And if we look at just single-handedly at the Utopi multi-sensor, for example, we collect 6 key environmental data points hourly. These, or the Utopi multi-sensor within an asset, will be installed within every space type. So it will be installed within every residential space, and ideally within communal spaces as well. The data that we collect is temperature, motion, which gives us an indication of occupancy, noise levels, air quality, humidity, and light. That data set on its own provides, I guess, kind of near real-time granular insight into how residents live within your buildings. The Utopi submetering, whether that's our own submetering or your existing submetering, which consists of, electricity, water, and gas. That data, I should say, not only provides context to the impact that residential behaviour has, but also provides the ability to baseline your assets, baseline performance, and set targets ultimately based on facts as opposed to estimating on past performance. And where we have heating controls installed, the combination between the environmental data, the submetering data, that allows us to accurately measure the positive impact that these changes in these controls actually have. So the value of the data, from investors right down to the people who live within these assets, everybody has a responsibility for net zero, and everybody.
Okay, please add me to that email address. I'm seeing, yeah, Daniel is away. It should be. So Daniel Ball.
Sorry, Claudia, if we could just ask you to pop yourself on mute. Thank you. Sorry, Stuart, carry on.
No, you're all right. You're all right. I thought that was a left field question for me there. It put me on edge. But I think everybody's looking for innovative ways to reduce energy use, the carbon output, and ultimately increase the performance of these assets. This granular level of data, it ultimately provides the visibility of opportunities for positive change through energy reduction. So if we look at the kind of key stakeholders and the kind of value of the data to them, we could go into each of these in a huge amount of detail, which is probably one for another session, if I'm honest. But just as a kind of high level overview, investors, this data helps increase the asset value from an operations point of view. It increases NOI. It provides the opportunity to identify opportunities for energy reduction. And putting the data into the hands of the residents will help improve resident experience and increase rebookers and hopefully customer satisfaction scores. If we look at it from an asset manager's perspective, it supports portfolio management, energy and carbon performance, and building level certifications. And then from a resident's point of view, putting the data into the hands of the residents through the Utopi app, for example, it provides them the ability to understand their usage, where they might rank within a building, but ultimately it will allow them to understand the impact that their behaviour has on the environment. Now, I'll touch on this a little bit further on in a couple of slides further on, but we're at the end of a change in behaviours programme that we have run, which was run by Utopi internally, but kind of driven by an external consultant. And one of the key takeaways from the engagement we had with residents was that they're hyper aware and super aware of climate change, but they have no way of understanding the impact on how they live within their homes and what that has in the environment. So being able to put the data into the hands of the residents is one really positive move. So the Utopi platform allows operators to automate insights at asset level right down to individual spaces. All of this reporting can be fully customised depending on ultimately what's important to the operator, what's important to that site and what's important to the residents, be that building level energy consumption or noise levels in an individual space at 3 AM on a Tuesday morning if they're investigating something like antisocial behaviour. The data set that we have available, it has such a broad range of use cases, and I think if I'm being really honest, we're still quite early in our journey to understanding what those use cases are. We just need to be asking more questions of it. We need the industry, we need our customers asking more questions of the data set. It's there, we have the data science team to do it. We just need to be asking more questions of it. The whole operational insights, if I'm honest, this is where I get quite excited about it. If I look just at one use case of the data, if we pick something like well-being, if we look at some of the environmental metric that we collect from the environmental sensor, so if we look at things like temperature, humidity, light levels, air quality, for example, that data set alone provides context to whether residents are living in environments that are conducive to cognitive development, for example. I'm no expert in this field, but there are a number of studies that have been carried out on that matter specifically. But we've been able to identify residents that haven't left their apartment or their studio for 30 days at a time. It doesn't appear that they're attending class, it doesn't appear that they're socialising. And I think in situations like this, as an industry, we've got a duty of care to those residents. We kind of stumbled across some of this by kind of accident when we were looking at kind of data and insights for operators. So at the moment, we have built an algorithm which now allows us to identify cases for potential well-being and intervention and report on those that meet that specific criteria set. So that's just one use case. If we look here, there's a couple of kind of busy graphs, so I'll talk through these just in a little bit of detail just to kind of bring them to life. If we look at the top image at the right here, this is analysis that we've ran on one building within a UK PBSA site. So this is one building at a site that has, I think, 2 or 3 other buildings within it. And what this data is actually telling us, it tells us the building, the space type, space number, what the type of that space is. But more importantly, this report is just specifically on electricity outliers. So who within these assets or who within this building is consuming what energy and what percentage of away from average are they? So we can see here that the top 4 outliers here, 12, 213, 234 and 121. That of the top outlier, this space 12 is consuming on average over a whole heating season. So this data is taken from October through to April. They're consuming nearly 44 kilowatt hours of electricity a day. Just to put that in perspective for people who are not too hot in kilowatt hours, I certainly wasn't not too long ago myself. Your average UK 3-bed home with 4 people living in it will consume, on average throughout a season, or throughout a year I should say, 8 kilowatt hours a day. So you've got one resident in one studio consuming 40 plus. That certainly raises questions. And we can see here that they're actually consuming 656% higher than site average, which is around 5 kilowatt hours. It's also worth pointing out that this asset specifically is wet heated, so none of this energy consumption is attributed to heating throughout the heating season, so it's just kind of classed as excessive usage. But if we look at space 12 within the platform, we could do a deep dive into that just by clicking on the space and going through. Within that, we can then see all of the environmental data that we get from the multi-sensor, and we can also see all of the sub-metering data, which provides a really, really good picture of how that person is living in their home and ultimately the impact that then has on that asset. So we can see here the graph below with all the horizontal lines on it, or vertical lines I should say. We can see that this resident consumes at some points up to nearly 50 kilowatt hours a day. Now, if we take all of these 4 outliers, for example, they're consuming 115 kilowatt hours a day over site average. Now, if that was to go undetected over the whole tenancy period, these 4 outliers in this building alone would cost the operator £12,000. And there's also a reduction of carbon opportunity there of over 9,000 kilograms. Now, if we take that one data set and extrapolate that across a whole site, and then we extrapolate that across multiple sites and across a whole portfolio, that number gets very big very quickly. And I will point out that this isn't an edge case. This is stuff that we see and we report on for operators day in, day out. This is the kind of daily bread, I guess, of the Utopi platform. Now, if we look at the numbers below, the kind of 53 and the 30 and the kind of 18,000, this is more of an edge case, and this is quite impactful. So I'll just touch on this briefly. We have one asset over the 23-24 heating season where 53% of spaces in this building had an average daily temperature above 24 degrees, and of the top warmest 10% of spaces, the average temperature in those spaces was 30 degrees. Now, I appreciate I'm from Scotland, but I don't think I would fly to a country that was 30 degrees, let alone choose to deliberately heat my home to that kind of temperature. And what we were also able to do within that asset was we were able to take the data from the Utopi multi-sensor. So we were looking at occupancy levels, and then we were looking to analyse the sub-metering and the energy consumed within unoccupied spaces within this asset. Now, this is an above average asset, granted, but between October and March, in unoccupied spaces in this one asset, they consumed 118,000 kilowatts of energy. That's the same amount of energy that your average 3-bed UK home with 4 people living in it will consume in 36 years. Now, as an industry, we cannot be proud of those stats. That kind of felt like a bit of a mic drop moment there, actually. In another scenario, I would love to have opened that up to the room for feedback and input and to have a discussion about it. Sadly, we can't do that today. Maybe that's one for another day. But what I would say is we now have the technology, we have the data, we have the insights to identify these opportunities and hopefully carry out the required interventions to tackle and reduce this energy waste. So the data that we collect is, I guess it's worth kind of pointing out, it's completely independent from the existing fabrics within a building. So for me, it kind of raises the question, so what insights has this been able to tell us about existing systems within these buildings that are already up and running and operational? So this image on the right hand side here, which I've just realised now looks like a spyglass. Wasn't actually meant to look like that when I put this slide together. But this is an image of the Utopi heat map, which resides within our SaaS platform, and the heat map provides a real-time overview of all of the environmental metric that we collect. So it's given us a real-time view of what's happening within these assets at any particular time. This heat map and the real-time data from it over the years has allowed us to help operators identify systems and controls that have been installed or configured incorrectly. So I won't go into these in too much details. The kind of high level numbers are here. But we're able to identify in one building down in London that the thermostat had been incorrectly calibrated to the heater, which basically meant that the heater was out by 4 degrees. So when the thermostat, for example, was set to 20 degrees, the target for the panel heater was 24 degrees. So in essence, the building was 4 degrees warmer than everybody actually wanted it to be. And another asset, we were able to help identify that during the installation of heating controls, there was an installation mapping error where the heating controls for one studio was actually controlling the heater installed in another studio. It sounds like a comedy of errors, but the result from that was that residents were essentially overheating other residents' homes. When we were able to identify that, we ran some analysis on the variance in temperature and occupancy levels, and we were able to establish that within that asset alone, that installation resulted in 60% of those residents regularly using the window to regulate their temperature. And something that we see, again, not an edge case, we identify this quite a lot, is where smart heating or smart heating systems or smart panel heaters have been installed, the range set when these heating controls have been installed are at manufacturer default settings. So we're installing these controls in these buildings, but what we're not doing is we're not then setting the controls at a sensible range. And we regularly see that when this technology is installed, we're then giving residents free range of putting their heating up to the maximum default setting, which in most cases is 30 degrees. You give residents the opportunity to put their heating up to 30 degrees, they will put their heating up to 30 degrees, and then they will find another way of cooling that room down without turning the radiator down. And the last example of this that we identified, it was actually only a couple of weeks ago, the operator has now bought the technology to go round and change all of the max set points within the heating controls themselves. Unfortunately, it has to be done at each individual room, which is going to take roughly 2 weeks. But with the data that we have on that asset, we'll be in a really good position next heating season to measure and understand the positive impact that small change has had. But I think we can all see and understand the impact that these opportunities that aren't identified and interventions haven't taken, the impact that has on energy waste and ultimately operating cost as well. Excuse me. So one of the one of the things that Utopi are just kind of rounding up at the moment is we ran a change of behaviours programme, which I mentioned earlier on, which essentially was a deep data-driven study to identify the correlation between the environmental data that we collect from the multi-sensor and energy data, which allowed us to, I guess, establish a baseline of resident behaviour. And we ran that study across 1,200 apartments and I guess multi-tenant assets with both BTR and PBSA. The aim of that study was to identify resident behaviour, understand things like temperature variability, and analyse occupancy levels. Some of the facts that we were able to establish from that study, where 10% of residents consistently run their rooms warmer than 24 degrees, 90% of overheated rooms regularly use a window to regulate temperature, and 50% of residents take at least 1 2-day break a month. And of those residents, between 75 and 95% fail to turn the heating down while they're away. And as part of the resident engagement that we did through focus groups and questionnaires, one of the things that kind of jumped out and stood out was that actually 45% of residents are completely unaware how the heating controls in their home works. So that alone is one massive opportunity for resident engagement to help control the waste within these assets. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just touch on a couple of these case studies really quickly. This case study has been made public quite recently. This is a case study we did with CA Ventures. We installed Utopi in a brand new building which already had existing energy controls and its own sub-metering in place. Residents were using boost buttons to control the temperature, but there was also a bit of a pandemic of residents installing external panel heaters at this asset. But part of the challenge was there was no real-time access to any of the data. So it was impossible to kind of identify and understand what was going on at this site. And following the installation of Utopi, within I think this asset was within around 2 weeks, the operator had full access to the data. They had access to weekly reports that they were then using to manage these outliers and confiscate a number of panel heaters. The starting average temperature at this asset was, I think, 22.5 degrees, and overall throughout the heating season, just driving the outliers down managed to reduce the average site temperature by 2.2 degrees. Just to bring that to life a little bit, over a heating season, that equates, or over 12 months, sorry, I should say, that equates to a total saving of around £50,000 worth of energy and a £68,000 reduction, or 68,000 kilograms of CO2 reduction. This is a case study that Utopi have ran in conjunction with CBRA, Harrison Street and DLC Europe. Harrison Street have rolled Utopi out across, I think, around 8,500 beds. It's maybe slightly more than that now, if I'm honest. The instant real-time granular ESG performance data and energy consumption provided kind of visibility of immediate opportunities for energy reduction. The previous case study is an example of one of these assets specifically, but across the Harrison Street portfolio, there's been roughly a 15% saving in energy consumption, which equates to, I think it's up to, yeah, it says here up to £125 per bed. All of this has resulted in a CBRE validated 9 times ROI, which equates to a £17 million increase in asset valuation across the portfolio where Utopi has been installed. I guess what I would say here, having the ability to turn the data into actionable insights for operators, for me, is where is where the real value lies. Without the operators' buy-in and without that engagement, these savings wouldn't be realised. It's one thing having all this data, it's one thing having all the insights, but if we don't take action off the back of it and we don't carry out these interventions, for me, the data has very little value. The data also supports asset level ESG reporting in a number of forms. So it supports GRESB submissions, it supports BREEAM new build, it supports BREEAM in use, specifically around asset performance and management performance, Fitwell certifications, and CREM calculations. Now, I am absolutely no expert in this field at all, so I will hand over to Cedric from ESG Europe, who will do a bit of a deep dive into this specifically. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Thanks very much, Stuart. That was great. Thanks for the short intro. I'll just introduce myself a little bit further. My name is Cedric Cools. I'm a director at ESG Europe. Hopefully you should be able to see all see my slides now. Essentially, I'm a chartered project manager with a background in property development of build to rent and PBSA assets, having been involved in delivery of several thousand units across Europe on behalf of real estate funds. In that role, sustainability was always very important to me and in the advice I was giving to my clients. So over the last few years, I decided to specialize and focus 100% on sustainability consultancy, and became a co-founder of ESG Europe and became a director at ESG Europe. So ESG Europe is a sustainability consultancy focused primarily in the real estate sector. We work on behalf of real estate funders, investors, developers, as well as asset managers across the holistic life cycle of a portfolio or an asset. So we get involved anywhere from the acquisition stage all the way through to design, construction, operations, and then eventually disposal. So that means we support our clients through strategic advisory at the governance level, anywhere from writing policies to developing ESG strategies, all the way through to the asset level, actually delivering asset level certifications like BREEAM and Fitwell. We, ESG Europe, have partnered up with Utopi to essentially become their advisory arm, and we deliver all the advisory services on behalf of Utopi. Over the last few years, one of the important and high demand services that we've been involved with is GRESB, GRESB assessment specifically. So that's what I wanted to focus on today, to explain, number one, what GRESB is, where does it fit in within the ESG agenda, and then how the Utopi product and all the campaigns Stuart was talking about actually support that GRESB assessment. So GRESB stands for the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, and it does what it says on the tin. It's essentially a global standard for benchmarking and reporting on ESG performance for companies that invest specifically into real estate. So it's an assessment standard specific for the real estate sector. It allows you to break down your performance in terms of governance pillars, environmental pillars, and social pillars. And a bit further down, I'll show you what that exactly means. But it also then allows companies to benchmark their performance from their development operations, so new construction assets, as well as standing investment operations for operational and occupied buildings. So where does GRESB fit in within the whole ESG agenda? Well, over recent years, mainly thanks to the evolving sustainability regulations, we've seen a shift from a bottom-up approach to ESG to what is now a top-down approach to ESG. So what we mean by that is that the continuously evolving sustainability and ESG regulations, which are targeting primarily the financial sectors, including real estate investors and funders, are driving a focus on improving the evaluation and transparency of ESG impacts, risks, and opportunities. So essentially, it comes down to data, better access to data, and actually sharing that data. Those investors and funders who have to comply with those regulations, as well as their investee companies, are reacting to the regulations by developing ESG policies and frameworks that set out how they will comply with those regulations. Once we have those policies, once a company has the policy, it's written and it's well developed, it's been implemented by their value chain and their teams and their stakeholders, they're now interested increasingly in actually seeing what impact has that had on their ESG performance across all their operations at both the company level and the portfolio level. So essentially, are we as a company now performing better or the same as our industry peers? And for that, they use the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. Finally, and only then, we get down to sort of an asset level of ESG, which is looking at building certifications, asset level net zero carbon strategy, and sort of specifications for designs. So previously, it was kind of bottom up. You might have considered it at the asset level, doing a BREEAM certificate, but there wasn't really a corporate approach or a strategic approach to ESG, which is what we're seeing now in the last few years. As I mentioned, the main reason for that shift has become the new kind of the evolving sustainability ecosystem, or the reporting ecosystem, to which there are really three key players. So we have the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. This is developed by the European Union and is by far the most developed of these three series, including the CSRD, the SFDR, and EU Taxonomy, which are well developed, and then soon to follow the CSDDD. A lot of acronyms there, but we're not really, planning to go through any of these regulations in detail on this particular call. So it's just to kind of set the scene in terms of where GRESB fits into that. The new one on the scene, let's say, is the International Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which are being developed by the ISSB. These are standards that actually the UK has committed to adopting as and when they release the specific standards. But the main takeaway from all these regulations is to understand that really if it all comes down to data, being transparent about that data and disclosing that data within regular reports. So what the ISSB are doing, they are looking to merge the financial reporting for companies with the sustainability reporting for companies. So that for the first time, both metrics will be reported and disclosed simultaneously. So the ISSB is essentially going to play the same role as the IASB, who are overseeing international accounting standards, which most governments in the world have adopted. And we're seeing that it's going to be very likely that most governments outside of the European Union will also look to adopt the ISSB reporting standards. Currently, only 2 of the standards have been released so far. So that's what I mean when I say that the European Union's framework is much more developed than the international framework. So what we have so far is the general requirements, which set out general sustainability related risks and opportunities that have to be disclosed. And then the first topical standard, which is focused on climate related disclosures. So this IFRS S2 on the climate related disclosures sets out what physical and transition risks reporting is required, how to report greenhouse gas emissions as a company, etc., etc. We already know that further down the line, there's also going to be topical standards on biodiversity, human capital, and human rights, but those have not yet been developed. So looking at IFRS S1 and S2 and kind of bringing it down to the real estate sector and how that impacts us in the sector. Essentially, both S1 and S2 require the use of SASB sectoral standards. The SASB real estate standard has some specific performance metrics in terms of how you manage your energy, your water, and your waste and other utilities, but also directly refers to GRESB as the normative reference standard for materiality assessments. So for the first time, we're kind of seeing how all these regulations, very complex documents, all boil down to actually actions taken at the portfolio and asset level. So GRESB will become increasingly important for real estate funders, investors, lenders, as well as companies looking to borrow money from these companies in the near future. So diving a bit more into what GRESB actually is and what it entails. So essentially GRESB has 3 key components. The first component is the management component, which looks at an entity's overarching strategy, the way that the leadership team is set up, what their policies and procedures are for managing risks and identifying risks. You then combine the management component with either a performance component or a development component to make up a real estate assessment. So the performance component looks at existing buildings, and the development component looks at construction assets, assets that are under development. The performance and the development component look at really asset level data and portfolio level data, not necessarily governance level or corporate level data. So when you submit into GRESB under either the standing investments portfolio, you will get a standing investments benchmark report. If you have just got development projects in your portfolio, then you will get a development benchmark report. If you have both, you can submit under all three components and get two reports, which are both the standing investments report and the development report. So next slide, this shows a spider chart, an example of the results spider chart from GRESB, showing the entity which reported into that year with the green line on the spider chart. And the gray is the peer group average. So this is the first image that shows how you can actually start to benchmark your performance as a company against your peer group average. When we say peer group average, this is a group of companies whose investment operations and activities are as closely matched to you as a reporting entity as possible. So take an example, if you're a UK developer investing solely in PBSA assets in England, you will be compared to companies who match that description as closely as possible. What you can see from the spider chart is very quickly identify weaker areas for this company. So waste was a weak area for this company, water was a fairly weak area for this company, and greenhouse gas emissions could definitely be improved in terms of that data accuracy. So that's the first time we start to look at, right, what is our current performance? Where do we need to improve? The next page also shows a bit more granular how you get benchmarked in terms of your ESG pillar breakdown. So you get specific breakdowns under the environmental pillar, the social pillar, and the governance pillar. And again, for each pillar, you have the GRESB average. So you are being compared to every entity that submitted into GRESB that year, as well as your specific peer group average as well. So when we with our work with Utopi, we did a study a few months ago to identify across the GRESB standards how many of the points or indicators in GRESB can actually be influenced by the Utopi software and product, as well as all the tenant engagement campaigns that get delivered by Utopi themselves. And we found that 14 indicators across the GRESB assessment are directly influenced by Utopi, which have a total value of about 49.75 points. So almost 50% of the GRESB assessment can be somehow influenced by Utopi product. This table shows this in a bit more granular detail. So essentially what we're looking at is targets. So actually being able to set science-based targets. It's very difficult for companies to set targets without knowing what their baseline performance is in the first instance. We have then tenant engagement programs. These are the campaigns that Stuart was talking about at the Aspen with Harrison Street. And then of course, actually managing the data more granularly and getting access to that data specifically. So I just wanted to dive in a few key examples of the actual GRESB assessment and how the Utopi platform supports these indicators. So the main focus I wanted to start with is on the energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and water use indicators of GRESB. So these are indicators that get collected at the asset level, put into the GRESB real estate asset spreadsheet, and then uploaded to the GRESB standard. Now, the way that these indicators get scored is across a series of metrics, which include the data coverage. So how much of your floor area have you got data available for? Have you got that same data available year on year? Or are you improving that data availability year on year? And then finally, what is the performance of that data looking like? Are you consuming more energy than last year, or are you continuously reducing your energy consumption, for example? Now, we've worked with many clients supporting them on GRESB assessments, and we typically see the same key challenges always appearing. The main one is actually that a lot of our clients still manage their data manually through invoices. Now, this can take several months to collect all these invoices, and there are clients that we've worked with where it's taken up to 5 months to collect invoices across a fairly small portfolio of 5 to 6 assets, purely because it's all managed by manual invoices. Sometimes we just have a poor data coverage, so we might have only landlord area data coverage in a commercial office building, for example, where we might have 5 different tenants, each of which manage their own utilities. We may not be able to get access to those tenant units data. Or sometimes, in some instances, we don't get any data at all. So we had a client in Ireland which hadn't had a water bill for about 2 years, and are now worried about actually asking for the invoices in case they've got a 200k bill they need to pay. And then finally, of course, there's a lack of internal resource within our clients to actually start managing this data. It's no one's key job or key role to simply manage ESG data. So what the Utopi platform does is, through the collection of that data on a granular basis, we are able to directly export all the data from the Utopi platform into the GRESB assessment spreadsheet, which immediately shows the year-on-year improvement, as you can see from this graph here, and also shows the overall kilowatt-hour consumption of electricity, gas, and the water consumption in cubic meters. So that facilitates that process massively and doesn't require anywhere near as much consulting time from our end to pull together that data. What we can then also do is, because it comes from a trusted source, we are able to then assure that data externally using the AA1000 standard, which again achieves additional points within the GRESB standard. Another area here, this is another extract from the GRESB standard. So this is looking at tenant engagement programs. As you can see, there are specific questions which look or drive companies to actually provide tenants with feedback on energy data, engaging through social media platforms to encourage reductions of that data, and then finally actually focusing on increasing the ESG awareness for tenants as well. So all the all the changing behaviors program and the campaigns that are being run by Utopi to take the data and proactively manage it and actually take action against that data is valuable from an NOI perspective, but also is just generally considered best practice of ESG and will go a long way in scoring GRESB points. Another key example here, community engagement programs, again, very similar to that resident engagement piece. What's also interesting is that there's a very specific section in GRESB looking at health and well-being programming for tenants as well as the local communities, and using that secondary data to understand how healthy is the environment in which your tenants are living. Are you considering environmental quality, and are you actually monitoring environmental quality as well as physical health and well-being? And the Utopi multi-sensor is a great tool to access that secondary type of data. So this is an example from a building in Liverpool, where we're looking at average temperature ranges within that building, as well as humidity ranges, CO2, noise, and together this creates kind of an environmental comfort score for each space within the building. So immediately we can start to identify scores that are less than average and start to engage with those tenants to explain, why it's bad to live in a flat where the CO2 particles per minute are so high. They haven't opened their window, or they haven't opened the curtains for 3 days. Why that's an unhealthy environment to live in, and engage with them to improve the environment in which they live in through the use of secondary data. So those were a few examples from the GRESB standards. Essentially, what is also very important for people to understand is that GRESB is an annual process. So it's not a standalone certification like a BREEAM, where new construction, where you do it once and it's valid for the life of that building. You have to resubmit every year to the GRESB standard, because the standard gets raised year on year. So we work with clients typically on a timeline running from January through to July for the assessment process, and then from July through to the end of the year for the gap analysis and action plan to improve the performance for the next year's reporting. So just to conclude then, why would people benchmark to GRESB? Well, the first instance, it applies a framework of international best practice standards, really helps clients who are just starting in the journey of ESG to focus their attention on what is actually considered best practice, and creates a clear pathway for them to start building their improvement of ESG performance. Once you get going, it also facilitates peer-to-peer performance. So you're able to showcase to your stakeholders that you're performing as good or better than your peers. And of course, it also helps with internal self-evaluation of your performance. And then finally, with GRESB now starting to be referenced in regulations, we're seeing that becoming a more important requirement to satisfy funder, lender, and investors compliance during due diligence for loans or funding on asset deals. Yeah, conscious of time, so I think we want to do a bit of the Q&A, so I'll finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cedric, and thank you, Stuart. It's yeah, really insightful information there. We'd like to kick off the Q&A. We've only got a few minutes, but if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat box here. We probably have time for one or two questions if you have them, but just to reiterate, we will be sending a post-session form, so you're welcome to submit any additional questions that you might have as well. So yeah, we'll wait for someone to type up. Otherwise, we can always bring this to a close. Cool. Okay. No questions in the chat, which makes it nice and easy. So yeah, look, I just want to extend a really big thank you to both Stuart, our Head of Impact, and Cedric, who's our advisory services partner. I hope you all found it really helpful today. We will be running more lunch and learn sessions through the year, so please reach out if you've got any questions or queries or particular topics that you'd like to hear about. But yeah, it was brilliant to have you all here. Thank you again. We'll give you 6 minutes back on your clock, and we hope to work with you all in the future. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everyone.